I can't believe it. I can't believe I actually have to think about the post-Jon Gruden era again. This is not good.
Hello, James. It is time for you to review the next head coach, the first of the post-Jon Gruden era. Are you ready to accept this challenge?
Yeah, I mean, ready isn't the word that I would use to describe this whole process anymore, but yeah, let's go, okay? Let's just review the next era. Which coach am I talking about today?
James, it seems like the hatred and anger for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is sinking into your heart. Very good to see. The next era that you will be reviewing is the Raheem Morris era.
Raheem Morris. Great. The Youngry Bucs. you remember that, right? The Youngry Bucs. Great. Oh, this is gonna be so good.
Go now and do your research, James. I'm sure the results that you will find will be disappointing. I will keep an eye on your progress. Until then, farewell.
Freaking Raheem Morris and the Youngry Bucs. Great. Okay. Hey guys, what's going on? James here, and in this video today, we are going to be talking about the Raheem Morris era. Now, who is Raheem Morris, right? Now, his era lasted from 2009 to 2011, but he does have a very interesting history before he became the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So, from 1998 to 2001, he was a defensive backs coach in college football, in small level college football at that, so he wasn't doing a whole lot, but he then joined the Tampa Bay Buccaneers from 2002 to 2005. He actually won a Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. During that time period of his first stint with the team, he held the positions of defensive quality control coach, defensive assistant, and assistant defensive backs coach. Again, he won a Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That is a very interesting fun fact in my opinion. He would then go on to spend 1 year at Kansas State as the defensive coordinator in 2006. He would finally return to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as the defensive backs coach from 2007 to 2008 before he was eventually promoted to head coach. Now, this was a little bit of an interesting situation as Monty Kiffin, he was leaving the Tampa Bay Buccaneers after a long tenure with the team. He was going to be joining his son Lane Kiffin in the college ranks, and Jon Gruden had actually tabbed Raheem Morris to be the new defensive coordinator in his coaching staff, but then the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they fired Jon Gruden and said, well, let's just go ahead and promote Raheem Morris to the head coach position. Now, Raheem Morris and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers during this era, if you will, were known as the Youngry Tampa Bay Buccaneers, as the roster was still rebuilding, but they did have loads of potential. They were one of the youngest rosters in the entire NFL, and I believe Raheem Morris was the youngest head coach in the NFL at that time. So yeah, they were youngry. I've never really liked that word, but that's what they called themselves. They were youngry. And yeah, so before Raheem Morris joined the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the previous year they had went 9-7, and the season before the previous year, when Raheem Morris was promoted head coach, they made the playoffs. So there was momentum in their favor. They definitely had some things going their way, but let's start talking about how this era started. Taking a look at year number 1 for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 2009, their final record was 3-13. Keep in mind, this is coming off of 2 9-7 seasons, and this was actually the first year the Buccaneers started the Ring of Honor, which is pretty cool. The first inductee was Leroy Selmon, which, if there was ever anybody for a Tampa Bay Buccaneers Ring of Honor that you would have as the first inductee, you'd probably pick Leroy Selmon. He was the first great Tampa Bay Buccaneer, and yeah, he definitely deserved to have that number 1 spot in the Ring of Honor. Mark Dominic was also hired as the general manager to replace Bruce Allen. So the Bucs were going with an entirely new set of people running the show. They also had 17 players on the injured reserve by the end of this season, which could have led to the record a little bit. Jake Plummer was supposed to be the quarterback for this team, but he basically said, nope, I'm good. I don't want to play for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and I believe he ended up retiring. He at least did not report to the team. So, yeah, not a great start. Their points for this year were 244. Their points against was 400 for a difference of negative 156, which we did not have those bad of differentials in the Sam Whitehead era. Those are like Lehman Bennett and maybe a little bit of Ray Perkins point differentials there. And for a guy like Raheem Morris, who was supposed to be a really solid defensive type guy, defense giving up 400 points against your team, giving up 400 points against, not a great look in year number one, but they were in a rebuilding mode in literally every single sense of the word. They lost, hear me out on this, they lost Jeff Garcia, who was a playoff caliber quarterback, Michael Spurlock, who was a solid return man, just a wide receiver in general, Derek Brooks, you guys remember Derek Brooks, the freaking Hall of Famer for this team, Warwick Dunn, Joey Galloway, Cato June, Ike Hilliard, Philip Buchanan, Brian Greasy, and Matt Bryant. They lost a lot of impactful players before the start of the 2009 season. They really were turning over a new leaf in every single sense of the word. Young new head coach, young new roster, new general manager. Like, they were really trying to push out the old guard, bring in the new guard, and make it work. And that is very much apparent here whenever you just break down all the people they got rid of. But one interesting thing to note was Bayern Leftwich was in the house, baby. That's right. Before he was the offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Bayern Leftwich was the quarterback on this team for a very short amount of time. I always love mentioning that to people, but they did also trade away a 2009 second-round pick and a 2010 fifth-round pick for Kellen Winslow II. We're not going to talk about all the things that Kellen Winslow II has done in his post-NFL career. We are going to specifically look at stats on a sheet of paper and leave it at that. But the draft did include, in terms of impactful players, Josh Freeman at number 17 overall. Don't worry, we'll get into him in a little bit. Roy Miller in the 3rd round and Sammy Schroeder in the 7th round in terms of guys who were impactful players in the draft. Some of the more notable players from this season included Josh Freeman, who threw 10 touchdowns to 18 interceptions. He started 9 games, which, not a good start for Josh Freeman. He was the number 17 overall pick, and he was a prototypical quarterback, right? Big, strong arm, decent athleticism, but not a good start to his rookie year. Josh Johnson was also another quarterback on this team. He started 4 games and he had 4 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. And then finally, Bayern Leftwich, hey, he started 3 games for this team and he had 4 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. So the point being, hey, Bayern Leftwich, you know, he could sling that rock, man. He could throw the football around. You could have made a legitimate argument that Bayern Leftwich probably should have been the starting quarterback for this entire year, but they wanted to see what Josh Freeman can do right away, get him some early experience. Didn't go very well. In terms of running backs, Cadillac Williams was still on this team, 823 rushing yards and 7 total touchdowns. Derek Ward, a free agent addition, had 409 rushing yards and 3 total touchdowns. In the receiving game, you had Kellen Winslow, who had 884 receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. Antonio Bryant had 600 receiving yards and 4 receiving touchdowns. On the defensive side of the football, Styles White had 6.5 sacks and 1 pass deflection. Jimmy Wilkerson had 6 sacks, 2 passes defended, and 2 forced fumbles. Barrett Ruud, who was a pretty darn good linebacker for this football team, had 143 tackles, 7 passes defended, 1 forced fumble, and 1 interception. Geno Hayes, another solid linebacker, had 98 tackles, 15 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 6 passes defended, 1 forced fumble, 1 fumble recovery, and 2 interceptions. So he had a little bit of everything. Really, Geno Hayes was just an all-around really good linebacker this year. I'm surprised he didn't make the Pro Bowl. Tenard Jackson had 5 interceptions, 2 touchdowns, 8 passes defended, 2 forced fumbles, and 1 fumble recovery. Again, I'm kind of surprised he didn't make the Pro Bowl. Aqib Talib had 5 interceptions, 15 passes defended, and 1 fumble recovered. He was a very good young cornerback, still very early on in his career. Albert Mack had 3 interceptions, 4 passes defended, and Rondé Barber, who was in the twilight of his career, had 2 sacks, 1 fumble recovered, 2 forced fumbles, and 6 passes defended. He was 34 years old. So, in terms of looking at how this team did, in terms of stats, the defense honestly was not that bad. I mean, the linebackers played good, the secondary was getting turnovers, pass rush could have been a little bit better, but what was more glaring and noticeable to me is that they did not have consistent quarterback play throughout the entire season. Again, maybe they should have considered playing Bayern Leftwich just the entire year and sitting Josh Freeman behind a veteran quarterback and having him learn. Same thing with Josh Johnson, but they wanted to see what their young quarterbacks could do, both in Freeman and in Johnson, and they did not do very good. The running game could have been better. The receiving game could have been better as well. The defense seems like they did their part pretty well. Just the offense, too many turnovers, man. Too many turnovers. 29 interceptions from 3 quarterbacks. You're not going to win a lot of football games that way, point blank. Moving on to year number 2, guys. 2010 season, and geez, this year was just... Anyway, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' final record was 10-6? Wait a minute, 10-6? They won? They had a winning season? Yeah, that's right. In the second year of the Raheem Morris era, they went 10-6, and they did not make the playoffs, which honestly is probably just as miserable as if you had a losing record. You guys remember whenever the Miami Dolphins just had a 10-6 record and they didn't make the playoffs because the AFC was just really loaded with playoff teams with winning records? That's exactly what happened to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers back in 2010. The NFC was just really good that year, and the Buccaneers weren't able to make the playoffs with a 10-6 record, which again, in my opinion, that is just about as miserable as having a losing record. But this was the second year of the Buccaneers Ring of Honor. This time it was John McKay who was inducted, and the award was accepted by Rich McKay, his youngest son, who was the general manager for this team for a handful of years, and that's a really cool thing. Again, right after Leroy Selman, in terms of the early history of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you think of John McKay, and I really do have a soft spot for the McKay family in terms of their place in Buccaneers history. So overall, I am happy with that. That's very cool. Their points for in this season were 341. Their points against being 318, which I believe this is the first time we have had a positive point differential in these era reviews since the John McKay era, so since the inception of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which is holy crap. But there was even more turnover from this team as there were 7 coaching changes during the offseason. They lost even more players. They lost Antonio Bryant. Remember him? He was a good receiver in the previous season. They lost Will Allen, who was a starter. They lost Jimmy Wilkerson, who was an impactful defensive player the previous season. They lost Michael Clayton, and they lost Derek Ward, who was at least a decent role player that previous season. So again, they continued to just have more roster turnover, more coaching turnover, but the draft was a pretty decent draft overall. They took Gerald McCoy with the number 3 overall pick. They drafted Aurelius Ben in the 3rd round, Mike Williams in the 3rd round, Cody Grimm in the 6th round, Dakota Watson in the 6th round, and then finally LeGarrette Blount was brought in as an undrafted free agent. Fun fact, Cody Grimm is now back with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as a coach. So there are just threads everywhere, man. This era has produced a couple of Tampa Bay Buccaneers coaches. Byron Leftwich and Cody Grimm are now both with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as coaches. That's just a very interesting fact. But in terms of looking at some of the more impactful players from this winning season in year number 2 of the Raheem Morris era, you had Josh Freeman, who just blew up in terms of taking a leap from year 1 to year 2. 25 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. That's pretty darn good in my opinion. LeGarrette Blount coming in year number 1, 1,007 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns. Cadillac Williams was still there a little bit. He was a role player and he was still doing some pretty decent things. 437 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. Mike Williams, 964 receiving yards and 11 receiving touchdowns. And Kellen Winslow, 730 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. Styles White on the defensive side of the football had 4.5 sacks and 2 forced fumbles. He was the leading sack player for this team that year, by the way. Barrett Ruud was still doing really good things. 118 tackles, 2 sacks, 1 interception, 4 passes defended, and 2 forced fumbles. Geno Hayes was still doing good stuff. 82 tackles, 4 sacks, 1 interception, 1 touchdown, 6 passes defended, 1 forced fumble, and 16 tackles for loss. Like, Geno Hayes was having a stretch of really good play here. So was Barrett Ruud. Rondé Barber, 82 tackles, 1 sack, 10 tackles for loss, 13 passes defended, and 3 interceptions. Gerald McCoy in his rookie year had 3 sacks, 5 passes defended, and 2 forced fumbles. Aqib Talib was still doing great stuff. 6 interceptions, 11 passes defended, and 1 touchdown. And Connor Barth, by the way, 82.1 field goal percentage, which I know doesn't sound good, but for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers during this time was pretty darn good. Also, Donald Penn made the Pro Bowl. So, yeah, this is kind of weird. The jump from year 1 to year 2 for this Tampa Bay Buccaneers team was astronomical. I mean, they went literally from a 3-13 record to a 10-6 record after just 1 year. That's phenomenal growth, and the future looked really darn bright. Josh Freeman seemed to have turned a corner. The rushing game was finally getting going. Mike Williams seemed to be a pretty decent leader in that receiving game. The defense, while the sacks still weren't there, you were still getting great linebacker play and great secondary play for the second year in a row. Things were looking up. So how does year 3 go? It didn't go well. It didn't go well at all. Guys, the final record for year number 3, 2011 of the Raheem Morris era was 4-12. They were looking to improve on their 10-6 season. That was a great year in year number 2. They wanted to make the playoffs for the first time since 2007. I know it hadn't been that long ago, but they were still looking for continuity. Josh Freeman had a solid second year. Things were looking up for both the offense and the defense. And then this season happened, and it all went horribly wrong. They were the bottom half of the league in both offense and defense in terms of scoring, and overall their offensive yardage was actually middle of the pack. Their points for was 287, their points against was 494 for a difference of negative 207. I don't think we've ever had a difference that bad before. Maybe like very early on, like maybe Lehman Bennett era in terms of having that negative of a difference. I think this isn't the worst difference we've had, but that really is going all the way back to the Lehman Bennett era in terms of negative point differentials. The season was tough for the team as they suffered multiple starters or role players being on the IR. Depth was not good enough to get the job done when all of those players did sustain their injuries, and they also brought in Albert Hainsworth, which at this point was basically like the kiss of death for a franchise because, yeah, it was Albert Hainsworth towards the end of his career. It was not going well. They lost Cadillac Williams, Barrett Ruud, and Al Woods, which I included Al Woods in here because it's just interesting to see how he was with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and then went on to be a solid role player defensive tackle for a large amount of years. So shout out to Al Woods. But they lost Barrett Ruud, who had a couple of really great years for this team before he was let go. And then Cadillac Williams, unfortunately, with injuries and just stuff that really derailed his play, it was time to let him go as well, sadly. You know, I really wish that Cadillac Williams could have been one of those guys that finished his career in Tampa Bay, but was not to be. The draft did include players like Adrian Claiborne, Daquan Bowers, Mason Foster, Luke Stalker, and Ahmed Black. Adrian Claiborne, number 20 overall pick, Daquan Bowers in the second round, Mason Foster in the third round, Luke Stalker in the fourth round, then Ahmed Black in the fifth round. Now, this was actually really interesting because Daquan Bowers, there was legitimate talk that this dude could have been one of the top prospects in the entire NFL draft. I don't remember why he fell to the second round. I believe injury concerns were a main thing, but it seemed like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had gotten a amazing draft haul. They got Claiborne in round number 1, and then they basically, a lot of people thought that they had stole Daquan Bowers in the second round. You include a solid linebacker like Mason Foster in round number 3, a reliable tight end in Luke Stalker in round number 4, and a solid safety like Ahmed Black in round number 5, and things were at least potentially looking up in terms of having young developmental type talent. Taking a look at some of the more notable players from Raheem Morris's final season, Josh Freeman had 16 touchdowns to 22 interceptions. So again, just plummeting back down to earth. He did start all 16 games, but Josh Johnson did get a little bit of playing time with 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. LeGarrette Blount had 781 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. Again, decline in play. Mike Williams, 771 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. Kellen Winslow, 763 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Decline in play. Although I will say Winslow, he was very consistent for those 3 years in terms of being an above 700 receiving yard type of tight end. Adrian Claiborne on the defensive side of the football, 7.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles. Michael Bennett, by the way, coming over from the Seattle Seahawks, 4 sacks, 1 forced fumble, 2 fumbles recovered, and 12 tackles for loss. Rondé Barber, 3 interceptions, 9 passes defended, 1 forced fumble, 1 fumble recovery, 1 sack, and 1 safety. So hey, at least Rondé Barber was pulling his weight. You know, Adrian Claiborne, he had a solid rookie year, but aside from that, especially in terms of the defensive side of the football, little to no impact. Like, I really did try and do my research and dig for some guys who had decent stats, but it just was not the case. I mean, Mason Foster did okay, but overall it was just a down year for a lot of guys, especially on both offense, in terms of offensive starters and defensive starters. Just everybody had a down year, and it was not a fun time, but Davin Joseph did make the Pro Bowl, which I guess is, cool. Well, shortly after year number 3, Raheem Morris would be fired in early January, and just 10 days later, he would join the Washington football team as their defensive backs coach, and he would continue to be a defensive coach for many teams, such as the Atlanta Falcons, and now currently with the Rams. He was also an interim head coach for the Atlanta Falcons, where he had a 4-7 record. But what can we gather? What can we learn from the Raheem Morris era? Well, Young Reed, to describe this team, was absolutely accurate. I mean, you name it in terms of old guard, they were changing it. The players that John Gruden had in his final couple of years, they were all gone. Jeff Garcia, even Derek Brooks was not safe from this new regime change. A new general manager was brought in. A young, fresh head coach was brought in. Very, very, very young roster, and that is part of it. They were in a rebuilding sense. I don't think that this was a team that was expected to win right away. You could argue that that year number 2 just absolutely came out of nowhere, given the, 2 bad years sandwiched in between that. But I think one of the biggest things that was not going well for Raheem Morris in terms of his overall tenure as head coach was Josh Freeman. 2 out of his 3 years were bad. I don't even know if I would have played Josh Freeman right away. I would have had a veteran quarterback maybe and sit Josh Freeman for a year or 2 and just have him grow and develop instead of just throwing him into the fire right away. They didn't have enough receivers. Mike Williams did some good stuff. Kellen Winslow, as I said, he was at least consistent, but it was not nearly enough. If you look at the receiving numbers, you look at the passing numbers, not even close to enough to win you football games. Too many interceptions, too many turnovers in years 1 and 3. The one year that they actually did really good, the turnovers were very minimal. So it really overall quarterback play and a lack of offensive weapons were huge in terms of the lack of success for this team during the Raheem Morris era. They were too young to be good right away. They were still trying to build some stuff up along the defensive line. They had some good linebacker play. They had some good secondary play, but that offensive side of the football, yeah, they had a couple of Pro Bowlers along the offensive line, but the quarterback wasn't ready. The running game was still pretty good, but still young and inexperienced after Cadillac Williams left, and then they had nothing in the way of wide receivers. So overall, guys, I just chalk this up to them being too young and, not ready right away, point blank. I don't know if Raheem Morris should have been fired after that 3rd year. I mean, it was a really bad 3rd year, But I don't know. I might have given Raheem Morris one more year because he did have that 10-6 record. And if you look, besides all of the notable players that I mentioned in all 3 years, the depth on these rosters was appalling, was absolutely appalling. I mean, the lack of depth was really, really bad, which basically forced this team to start many rookies, many inexperienced players, which again, I think was one of the main catalysts for why this team didn't do good in years 1 and 3. You could argue year 2 was basically a fluke and just a product of maybe pure luck. Because again, they were still super young. They were still not ready. Josh Freeman, yeah, he had a great second year, but then he plummeted back down to earth in year number 3, much like the entirety of the team. So, I don't know, guys. I don't know. I might have given Raheem Morris one more year. They were in a rebuilding mode. He was thrown into a really, really tough situation. And overall, I think Raheem Morris could be a good coach. He was young. He was inexperienced. His whole roster was young and inexperienced. He wasn't really getting much help from his general manager in the way of draft picks and free agent signings and things like that. Raheem Morris was dealt a bad hand, in my opinion. He was given a bad situation, and who knows? Maybe he'll become a head coach here in the very near future, and he can redeem himself. I think it's definitely possible because, yeah, he just wasn't dealt a good hand. Raheem Morris, the Youngry Bucs. I mean, geez, that was a young team that, had a couple of interesting guys, but dude, that depth was bad. They didn't have anybody. If somebody got hurt, they had nobody to replace that player. That was a really tough couple of years.
James, how do you feel after reviewing the Raheem Morris era? Have you begun to finally hate the team you love so dearly?
Yeah, that wasn't a fun one to review. The Youngry Bucs. Yeah, they had a great year too, but just, geez, man, that was painful, man. Come on, you gotta give me a break here.
A break is something you will not get, James, as you need to begin research on the next era that you will review, that era being the Lovie Smith era.
Lovie Smith. Great. Lovie Smith. I had such high hopes for Lovie Smith, man, and then it didn't work. Why are you doing this to me?
The reason I do this to you, James, is because you must see the truth. That truth being that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are a team that always has been and always will be a team that will be terrible. I want you to renounce your fanship and begin to hate this team that you have loved for many years of your life. With that being said, go begin to get ready to review the Lovie Smith era. Until then, farewell.
Great. I've got to review Lovie Smith. Alright. I guess I gotta get ready.